Welcome back, everyone. I'm the Bad Luck Gamer, and today we have our first rogue build, I'm pretty sure, and also our remaster rogue build as well. I'm going to be doing builds for all the classes after the remaster. Of course, not all the classes are currently released for post-remaster stuff, and of course, there are some classes that don't have a remaster coming up because they weren't in Advanced Player's Guide or Core Book. Regardless, I'll be making builds for anything that changes. I am predicting a Magus build probably coming up soon. But today we're talking about my one-shot rogue build. And this is, it's exactly what it says. This is a build designed to one-shot an enemy even before combat starts. You want to play a sniper, you want to play, someone who can take something out before combat starts. This is the build for you. It very much is get as much damage as possible right at the beginning of combat, and I absolutely love it. So let's go ahead and talk about it. First, let's talk about our attribute focus. Our attribute focus is predominantly going to be Dex. Obviously, we're using guns, so it makes a ton of sense. Intelligence is the second attribute that I'm selecting, and that's mostly because one of the strengths of Rogue is the sheer number of skill proficiencies that it gets. And with the higher intelligence, we just get more starting skill proficiencies, which could come very much in handy during the course of our adventure. But more than that, we are going to need it for a dedication. Granted, that's not until the end game anyway. And our third skill focus is going to be strength. And this is predominantly for the use of athletics, and only because athletics is just going to be helpful for our character if they want to climb a tree, get on top of a building, do all kinds of things. So the higher our athletics is, the easier it is for our character to get to our sniping post to do the job that they're going to do. All right, next we're going to talk about the skill focus. The first skill we're going to focus on is stealth. This just makes a lot of sense. We're a rogue. A lot of easy ways, especially for ranged characters, to make an enemy off guard is by using the hide action. So that being the case, we're going to be using stealth a lot. And when we're doing our whole setup, it's going to be very paramount that we are hard to detect. After that, we're going to put points into crafting. Crafting is going to be huge for a variety of reasons, but mostly just crafting is going to be very good for producing like any kind of equipment we need, producing bullets, which is going to be a part of the build, and as well any kind of weapon or enchantments or the like. Gear is very important when it comes to damage, so having crafting ability is really good. And since we're a rogue who gets so many skill proficiencies anyway, and we don't have a lot of like actual skills we're going to be using in combat, like fainting with deception or anything like that, honestly, this is probably the way to go. And our third skill focus is going to be athletics. As I mentioned before when I was talking about our strength, athletics is going to be necessary for us getting to where we need to, whether it's up in a tree, on a building, or what have you. Athletics is just going to be very much necessary depending on the scenario, I guess. But it's just good to have in general. So for our rogue Raka that we're going to take, it's honestly not a super big deal, but Thief is the best one for us. Not only are we just a super dex-based character anyway, so even if we do pick up a finesse weapon, we'll have all the stats we need for it. But in addition to that, it does provide one feat that is actually going to make this build even better. So Thief, though, if you want to go outside of that for other purposes, like Mastermind, if you want to do more recall knowledge stuff, that's certainly understandable, but Thief is what I'm using for this build. So on to the feats. Let's just go ahead and start off with our level 1 feat. As a rogue, we get one at level 1, so we can't pick up any archetype dedications yet. And honestly, I'm telling you now, there's not many rogue feats we're picking up in this build. And your level 1 feat is actually not super important. I picked Nimble Dodge. Nimble Dodge is really good as just a reaction for a character that doesn't normally have reactions. In case we need to get out of the way of harm, it's just nice to have. You can pick whatever you want. Nimble Dodge just felt like the most useful to me. Now at level 2, this is where a lot of the build is just going to vary from table to table. So their guns are a big part of the setting, but they're also like a rare part. All guns in the game have the uncommon trait, and while uncommon and rarity traits are mostly used for things like Pathfinder Society League or whatever, it is something that some GMs take into consideration. I know in my games, I don't let players have access to guns unless they either come from an area with guns in their background or they pick up a archetype dedication like the Gunslinger, which gives them access to guns, even though that's not what the dedication says. Regardless of how your table interprets how the uncommon gun features work, we want guns because the fatal trait is going to be a huge part of what makes this build really good. So guns are going to be probably the best when it comes to that. So at level 2, we're taking the Gunslinger dedication and we're taking the Sniper way. And that's for obvious reasons. We're a long distance character who was going to do extra damage on the first round of combat. So it makes a lot of sense. We don't get the initial deed though until we pick up a later feat. It's just something to keep in mind. And at level 4, we're going to select the basic shooting Gunslinger feat, which is going to give us access to Munitions Crafter. Munitions Crafter is an insanely good early level feat from the Gunslinger dedication. It allows you to craft free special bullets every day. And there are elemental bullets that just do extra damage, which is just going to be really good for us. So that being the case, it's a really, really solid pickup, and it's going to make extra use of our crafting, which is very, very good. At level 6, we get Slinger's Readiness, which is going to give us the initial deed for the Sniper way. This deed allows us to, on the first attack in a combat, deal extra precision damage. And this extra damage actually still increases as we level up, getting to eventually 3d6 extra damage at level 15 on our first strike on our first turn. Now, this is actually insanely good because one part of this build is the whole point is our character is getting down, getting ready, setting up a shot, and firing at the enemy when they don't see it coming. And so we're initiating combat with our first strike. Now, whether that counts for the deed or not is something that's actually kind of contentious. It's the thing is you're rolling stealth for initiative. Now, technically, how surprise rounds work in Pathfinder Second Edition is when a sneak attack or when I guess an ambush is engaged, initiative is rolled first, and then everything happens. So technically, under Raw, I feel like this works. Though how most people tend to play it, that's actually not. It's a little bit weirder. I would rule it that that's how it works because that's kind of the intent. It's your sneak attack round, more or less. Makes a ton of sense. But, I will say this is somewhat contentious. In any regard, this is still a really good benefit as dealing extra precision damage on our first strike into combat, even without the whole, setting up a combat by shooting an enemy first, is still a really good feature to have. Next up at level 8, we're actually going to dip into the Assassin dedication. This is going to help us in a variety of ways. But for a build completely based on attacking an enemy when they're completely unaware at the start of combat, well, I guess you can see where it's going. Now, this does have a lot of requirements. It needs alchemical crafting, deception, and stealth. Now, stealth and crafting are already skills that we're picking up in this build anyway. So by level 8, all you need to do is make sure that you at least get trained in deception. Pretty easy. And we actually get alchemical crafting through Munitions Crafter. So we don't even have to spend one of our skill feats, though we're a rogue and we get skill feats every level anyway. So that wouldn't have been an issue, but it's just kind of nice that the build kind of lends itself into this part of it already. Now, when we pick up the Assassin dedication, we get the Mark for Death. And while this is not super relevant, it is good for one feature, which is it gives us a bonus on perception checks to seek targets. If you're sniping from a distance and you're watching the enemies, your GM probably is going to want you to make perception checks. And so if you have a target that you're following, this is actually insanely good. Plus, we're going to need Mark of Death for a later feature from the Assassin dedication. So that being the case, it all works out pretty well for us. Another amazing benefit to this is that any agile or finesse weapon we're using, which we're a thief racket rogue, so our finesse weapons not only use our dex to hit, but also for damage. Those weapons also gain the backstabber and deadly d6. And if it already has the deadly trait, we actually improve that deadly trait by 1 step, which is really, really good. So this actually gives us some decent melee options and ways to work in melee combat without completely relying on our gun. Though, the build is designed to be a really good sniper and not necessarily good at much else. So this is really nice to kind of even us out a little bit, especially in melee combat, if it comes down to that. Now, at level 10, we're actually going to be selecting a rogue feat for once. Yeah, we do have a couple, or a few rogue feats anyway, in this build. We're going to be going to select the precise debilitations, which is really good because it requires the thief racket. As I mentioned at the beginning, towards the beginning of this video anyway, that there is one thief racket specific feat that we need to select. And this one's really good, mostly for the debilitation of the enemy takes an additional 2d6 precision damage from your attack, or from your attacks, essentially. This is really good, and while it's not necessarily really good for our first shot, as this doesn't add damage, the debilitation just lasts until the end of your next turn, your follow-up shots are going to hurt even more if we even need to. It's a very strong feature, and it's really good, and also, even if we're not taking it for the additional precision damage, we can also just take the enemy is flat-footed until the end of your next turn, which is also really solid. Regardless, this is a very powerful feature that we can utilize, considering that we're just going to be nailing an enemy right at the beginning of combat anyway. And while the point of the build is to kill an enemy right out the gate, this has a lot of application that can be done in combat as long as we're using our actions to sneak, hide, and make other shots, So regardless, this is a really good one and a very solid pickup. Now, at level 12, we're going to be picking up Assassinate. Now, Assassinate is one of those feats that a lot of people struggle with because it doesn't have a lot of in-combat benefits. The thing is that you need to be, it's not even, that you need to be unnoticed by the target, not undetected. Undetected is the best we can get in a combat situation. Unnoticed is something that would happen even before combat. Now, again, the whole point of this build is that we're initiating combats using our sniping abilities. So that being the case, this actually plays in really well. We can sit and watch the enemies from a distance at our leisure. We can mark them for death without having to worry about anything, and then we can use Assassinate. So with Assassinate, you strike with one swift movement, trying to instantly slay your mark. You make a strike against your mark. If you hit, the mark takes 66 extra precision damage with a basic fortitude save against your class DC, whichever is higher, or spell DC, whichever is higher. If the mark critically fails, they die. This is an incapacitation effect. The creature then becomes temporarily immune to your Assassinate for a day. So why this is really good is it just gives us a chance to instantly kill an enemy, and even though it requires the enemy to critically fail, it's still a 5% instant death chance on our first strike, which is really good. But even without that part, 66 extra precision damage is insane. That's really good because I don't even think I talked about it. Yeah, I picked this build for Rogue specifically because Rogue has one of the easiest extra damage you can apply. Investigator has something similar, but they need to use their devise a stratagem in order to get it, which actually we're going to get to here in a moment. But Rogue, with sneak attack getting up to 4 sneak attack dice, we are doing, essentially, with this, at endgame, 10d6 extra precision damage, not including the fatal damage we're adding from our weapon. And all that can be doubled on a crit, which is pretty insane. So that being the case, this is where the build really starts feeling pretty meaty here at level 12. Your first initiating shot on enemies that are unaware of you are going to hurt, and it's probably going to kill like an enemy right out the gate. Like, I would recommend using this for killing either like the upper elite enemies in a boss battle, or even just like to help clear out some of the more annoying enemies. You can shoot a caster right out the gate, for instance. There's a lot of ways that this shot can be very beneficial. And of course, as the combat goes on, you can then reload, hide, or stride and hide, get ready for your next shot to do a bunch of extra damage. It's a build that is based on the idea of, do you want to do like the most damage you can do in a singular strike? Because that's kind of what this build is based on. Now, at level 14, we're going to take Angel of Death, and there's actually no major reason for this. You can actually select any assassin feat at this point. it really doesn't matter. We just need it because we need to get 3 feats in order to get our next multi-class R-type dedication we're taking after this one. I chose Angel of Death because it just kind of fit the theme. If you did just straight up down someone with that was marked for death, they just die and can't be resurrected unless they beat your class DC with a counteract check, I believe. So that being the case, it was just there to select. I mean, you can see it here on screen. It is handy, sure. I don't think the situation will come up a lot, but we're only selecting this to select our next archetype dedication feat, which is going to be the Investigator dedication. So the Investigator dedication is going to give us some extra skill proficiencies, which is good, and some extra out of combat stuff like, pursue a lead and clue in and everything like that. But what we're really here for is at level 18, we're going to take the Investigator stratagem, and this is going to allow us to devise a stratagem. This is an insanely powerful feature, and actually one that makes this build very strong. And there's actually a point I want to make here. You can actually swap out Investigator and Assassin in this build and just get this feature sooner if that's what you feel works better for you. I liked picking up Assassin sooner than Investigator just because it gave us some non-gun related stuff that we could do. We get some cool features for finesse weapons, which we're already good with, and some good like out of combat, like pursuing a target kind of bounty hunting style stuff we can do with the assassin dedication. But if you swap it with Investigator, that's all fine. The only difference is then you would need to find a third Investigator feat to select before dipping into Assassin, and then we would just be dropping Angel of Death in this build. So either way, getting the stratagem is really good. Why is it really good? Well, as long as you're well hidden and as long as nothing majorly changes, you can continuously devise a stratagem until eventually you roll a critical. This is why the build is really good, and this is why you're a sniper. I actually like the thought behind the build too, is as you're getting better at being a sniper, you're getting more and more accurate until eventually you don't shoot until someone is guaranteed to take a hit. This pretty much guarantees criticals at this point. And the insane thing is that we could pick this up again by like level 12 pretty easy if you wanted to swap it with Assassin. This allows us to, at the start of combat, double the damage of a fatal weapon and the tons and tons of precision dice that we have available to us, in addition to whatever weapon runes we have and the like. It's insanely good and it's insanely powerful. It's only really meant for the first strike in a combat. And given some scenarios, I doubt it's going to be useful against many bosses. Many bosses tend to be in enclosed spaces that it would be very hard to kind of set up something like this without them noticing. Not that it's impossible, it's just harder. But for a large number of scenarios and for a lot of different types of combat, this is really, really good. And it's actually pretty easy to get off considering that the distance that some guns can fire is insane. And because we're rolling until we get a critical, one of the benefits is even if we're attacking at multiple range increments, that's actually not a big deal because, as long as the shot would hit with the penalties, the crit will just upgrade it to a critical shot, which means that we can shoot at a pretty far distance and get reliable crits anyway, which is pretty insane. And actually, it's at this point that I went back and I selected critical debilitations. Critical debilitations for our level 20 feat might not be as good, but it really works out for this build because, well, it's based on getting a critical with one of your sneak attacks. What critical debilitation really does is it kind of stacks on what the enemy needs to worry about. They need to make 2 fort saves when they get struck, 1 to avoid instantly dying with our Assassinate, and 2 for our critical debilitation to avoid either becoming slowed or straight up paralyzed. And it's paralyzed until the end of your next turn, which is very nasty. So even if the enemy does live, it's going to be very hard for them. And while this does have the incapacitation trait, because even if they succeed, they're slowed 1 until the end of your next turn. So whatever they do, they're going to lose an action on their next turn, which is really, really good. Now, we're going to talk about the gear. So what weapon are we going to be using? Well, this weapon, I don't know what this is, like a rifle. I don't know what this is supposed to be, because the weapon we're going to be using is the arquebus, and this does not look like an arquebus. Some kind of weird rifle. The arquebus is my recommended weapon, though it does have kickback, and while kickback does add 1 to our damage, it also subtracts 2 from our attack. So early game, unless you're picking up a tripod, which I'm going to recommend one here in a moment, you can also go with the double barrel musket, which can do the same thing with its double shot, the same kind of damage, but it just doesn't have kickback. So the arquebus is overall the weapon we're working towards. And with the use of a tripod, you can actually negate the kickback penalty, which makes it just do extra damage, which is pretty good. And the arquebus itself has fatal D12. So if you critical, it will upgrade its damage to D12 damage and then add an additional D12. Now, the additional D12 added is only added after critical damage is done, but still we're rolling 2d12 damage, or we're rolling a d12 times 2 damage on critical plus an extra d12 plus our sneak attack plus whatever else weapon runes whatever we're having on here. So this is something that I highly recommend. It's a very, very good gun, but like I said, the musket works similarly and can get the job done. Now, I did mention the tripod. Now, technically, this is a bipod, but it does the same thing. The forked bipod is going to be really good because not only one, does it help us with kickback with our gun when we're doing our sniping, but 2, it doubles as a spear. You can disassemble it, or you can tripod it, I guess, and you can turn it into a spear. The spear is agile, has deadly D6, and is a finesse weapon, which is really good because when we take our assassinate, this also actually becomes a deadly D8, and it gains backstabber. So if the enemy is flat-footed, it will do additional damage as well. And it's an agile weapon, so it's really good. And it's finesse, so we can use our dexterity for both the attack and damage. And it's a simple weapon. It's a spear, so we don't even have to worry about any weapon proficiencies. This is a really good weapon to have on hand when things get crazy and, we have our tripod. I wouldn't necessarily rely on it, but I do think it's really cool of just straight sticking to the sniper aesthetic. And the only way you kill enemies is with your sniper or with the tripod you use to snipe them with. I think that's really fun. So the forked bipod is a really, really good addition to this. And one additional thing I'd like to add is the magnifying scope. So one of the problems with this build, I think with a lot of GMs, is that, okay, so sure, and the arquebus, I believe, has a 120 range. We just looked at it a moment ago. No, 150 range. So 150 range at even just a couple, even like the second range increment, we can do up to 300 feet away. There are some GMs out there who are very much a stickler for okay, they're 300 feet away. You technically can shoot them, but can you really see them? They're really far away. Well, we have the magnifying scope. It's actually not even that high of an item level to get it. Level 3, which, our build's not even fully running by that point anyway. So we can pick this up pretty early. And the magnifying scope, I mean, it doesn't even do anything. It just says that you can see people from a distance away. And it does, it does do something because the scope itself gives us an item bonus to perception checks to seek creatures through the scope. And we can also activate the scope, increase the range increment of the weapon which the scope is attached by 5 feet until the beginning of your next turn, or until you're no longer wielding the weapon, whichever comes first. 5 feet's not a big deal, but at our second range increment, technically that's a 10-foot increase. So 2 range increments, which is only a -2 to our attacks, which is already, when we're talking about devise a stratagem, not even going to be an issue. Well, yeah, we can hit an enemy from easily 310 feet away, which is really good. And if we just add one more range increment, then it's 465 feet away. That's a really far distance. We have a scope, so we can justify it in game. If you have a GM who's a weird stickler for how vision works and everything like that, we get bonus to perception checks. And yeah, it's a really good way to make the enemy just I mean, they have no chance. As long as it's in an open enough area, like where you're going to attack a fort or something, this setup works really, really well. And even if it's something that's a little bit more precarious, like you're going through a set of caves, well, you're a rogue, and scouting is one of your like almost inbuilt features. You're gonna have a really high stealth, so you can move through a cage. You see an enemy, all you have to do is just be very quiet, line up your shot, and then bam, we get all our extra damage, and then you can whip out the tripod and use it as a spear to attack people. It's honestly a really decent build, and it works really, really well. Now, typically at this point in the video, I go into the archetypes that I recommend for the build if you're using the free archetype rule. Well, I already kind of have 3 archetypes just kind of like built into the build, and I don't really think many other archetypes could really super benefit it other than give us some other things to do, like outside of combat, for instance. So instead, if you're using the free archetype role, you can take all the multi-class and archetype dedication feats in that. And so I'm going to recommend 5 rogue feats that can help increase the efficacy, yes, efficacy of this build. First, I'm going to recommend mobility. It's really good. The enemy comes up, runs up on you, and pins you down. Mobility is just an easy way to get out of combat, or at least get out of a reactive strike range, which is really solid and honestly very good for this build. Analyze weakness will put our intelligence to good use, and the thing about analyze weakness that's really cool is that it doesn't have to be done in the same turn. All you have to do, the only prerequisite to use this, is you've at least used a recall knowledge on the creature, and it must have been identified. So it must have been, I guess, a success on that. So that being the case, what Analyze Weakness does is it's an action you use to make your next sneak attack essentially double its damage dice, which is absolutely nuts. That being the case, when we're watching our enemy from a massive distance through our scope, we have tons of time to mark them for death, to make recall knowledge checks to learn everything about them. And then when you're ready to strike, all you need to do is pop Analyze Weakness and let it go, and technically you can then assassinate because it all work. Well, actually you can't assassinate because that would be too many actions for a round in outside of this combat situation. So you could use Analyze Weakness or Assassinate, whichever you think is better in the situation, up until you get Assassinate. Then Analyze Weakness is really good, and Analyze Weakness can be used anytime you're about to make a sneak attack on an enemy, while Assassinate can only be used once. So that being the case, Analyze Weakness is actually pretty insanely good to add to this build and puts our intelligence to good use, as I said before. The next feat I'm going to recommend is Sneak Adept, which is the renamed version of Sneak Savant. And more or less what it does is whenever we roll a failure on a sneak check, we actually get a success instead, making us incredibly stealthy. Now, you can still critically fail the sneak, but that's probably not going to be an issue more often than not, unless you just get really unlucky. So that being the case, Sneak Adept just kind of adds to the fact that we are stealthy, and it makes it harder to detect us. It's actually insanely good because even if the creature has really good perception, as long as you don't crit fail, you are just still going to get a success, which is really, really good. Now, another one I'm going to recommend is going to be a little bit of a weird one, but we are putting some points into our strength in this build anyway, and that's going to be Powerful Sneak. So the reason why I recommend Powerful Sneak for this build, even though it's a really late level, like end game kind of thing, is because it does get rid of one of our biggest weaknesses. So being a sniper, the biggest weakness we have is for enemies that don't take precision damage, which can be very frustrating, I'll tell you. This build is not designed to normally deal with this kind of thing. Powerful Sneak, what it does is in this situation where our headshot, our initial salvo is not really going to do a whole bunch of the enemy, or at least not going to kill them right out. Well, we can opt to use our strength and still apply our sneak attack to enemies, changing the damage from precision to normal damage as long as we're using our strength modifier to hit. So this is kind of like a last-ditch effort kind of thing. It's something that only really is going to be necessary when you come up to enemies that are immune to precision, but that is actually not super uncommon. So that being the case, having a good out in this kind of situation just helps the build. So that's why I'm going to recommend Powerful Sneak. And the last feat I'm going to recommend is Hidden Paragon. And Paragon is insanely good because just as a reaction on a successful sneak or hide, we just become invisible for a minute and nothing can reveal us. This makes us really powerful because anytime we strike an enemy while invisible and nothing can see you, not glitter dust, see invisibility, or whatever, unless it comes from like a divine artifact, probably, which it doesn't actually say in the feat, which I think is very interesting, but that's kind of just like the thing in the game. We're just going to be able to get our sneak attacks off. We don't have to do any special setup or even sneak into hiding. At this point, once we successfully sneak once, pretty much for the rest of the combat, we're able to get our sneak attacks off without any extra effort, which is insanely good. And so, for a build that doesn't have any reload effectiveness, which is kind of a pain point of the build, since if you want to run and sneak and hide and do all kinds of things, well, they're each going to take an action. That's not going to be a super big problem because one of the big points of this build is our big point is to hit really hard at the beginning of combat before anyone realizes we're there and probably kill the enemy that we shoot more often than not. I mean, with Assassinate and our sneak attack, that amount of damage is insane. But yeah, so we're finally going to get to the Ancestry Heritage and then we're going to be all done. So one Ancestry I really recommend is going to be the Elf with their Mithril Tree. The Mithril Tree weapon is really cool. It gives us a gun that actually has the parry trait, which is really good. Now, it's not as good as the Arquebus. It doesn't have the kickback trait, so it is missing out some of the damage. But if you want to be able to duel off people with your gun, it's pretty cool. It's a really interesting aesthetic, and elves have all kinds of really good features. Also, just being very fast themselves. There's a lot of good ways that the elf can be used with the sniper to set up a very powerful, aesthetic and theme for your character. Speaking on aesthetics and theme, my other recommendation is going to be the fetchling. The fetchling, for obvious reasons, they are the entities of darkness, more or less. You're capable of hiding in shadows much more easily. This just improves our sneaking ability even more and, well, makes us an even better assassin in a lot of ways. And yeah, that's going to be it for the build. This is the one-shot rogue build. I would have called it the one-shot kill build, but, YouTube doesn't like that word. So it's the one-shot rogue build. I hope you all enjoy. If you did, leave a like on this video and subscribe as I try to get one video out a week on Pathfinder 2E builds, and I talk about all other kinds of tabletops here anyway. So if you love TTRPGs, this is the place to be. That being the case, thank you all so much for watching. Good luck with your games. Leave the bad luck to me, and I'll see y'all next time. Bye.